Well, here we are. So this is week 4. We're in the last week of our seasonal work through our estate vineyard here on Red Mountain. So now we arrived in autumn, the most exciting time of the year, arguably the most exciting time of the year, where we get to harvest all the grapes we've been working so hard to grow. I was just mentioning before, this picture is from our patio from about 15 minutes ago. We got some mums and some pumpkins to decorate for fall. Hopefully they'll still be good, and when you guys are around, they should be. But we wanted to feel a little more festive around this time. But it's just been absolutely gorgeous. The weather's been perfect for harvest. It's been cool enough that we don't have to worry about over ripeness, so that we can schedule some things out and broaden some things when we can. At the same time, though, we'll talk about it. Things have also been a little more condensed than usual than other vintages, just because that's kind of the way it is when you're adjusting to different vintage variations. So again, back to our vine growing calendar. We are now into harvest, so September, October, November. You know, depending on, and I think I said this as a caveat, obviously we're in the Northern Hemisphere, so we harvest at this time. If we were in the Southern Hemisphere, if you ever get wines from Chile or Argentina or Australia and South Africa, they're basically just 6 months opposite of us. So this is when they're just now waking up. Their bud burst and their vineyards are starting to grow leaves, which is super exciting for them. But for us up here, this is our fun harvest time, and then bringing wines into the cellar and into the winery. So the things that we're doing now as we get ready for harvest, I think I mentioned this last week too, is that there's basically one last pass, and they call it a color pass. So it's another, all done manually by hand, a way to thin some things, which, we've talked about suckering, we've talked about thinning, green harvesting, and stuff like that. All of it is basically to make sure that all the remaining energy that the plant is producing is put into those final clusters that you're trying to get optimally ripe. So this is our sort of a pre-sort. We'll talk about cluster sorting in the cellar, but this is a way to go through and actually see, to look at different fruit clusters, decide which ones aren't fully veraised or haven't gone through veraison. You could find other clusters that might just be, like we had talked about, mirandage or coulure or some of these other issues where you have clusters that didn't ripen fully. If something has too much of that, then it could be picked off and dropped at this point. And this is also, you're still taking away extra shoots or extra leaves that might be coming off of cordons or trunks. Again, just basically saving all the remaining energy for those grapes. At this time too, and really throughout the months of August and September, getting closer to the harvest, sampling is a really crucial part of the process. So Chris Peterson, who's in this picture further away, and then John Sigmar, who's our production winemaker, who's a little closer, they'll come out every so often. Chris is basically out in Eastern Washington maybe once or twice a week all through this time, visiting all the different vineyards and blocks that we work with to get samples, to do some tests, to try to figure out how close are we getting to picking. And this is kind of how it works. You walk through the vineyard. You basically want to take samples of each vineyard, each block, each variety, based on how you're going to vinify it. Like if you're basically planning on taking a whole vineyard that's maybe 2 different clones or 2 different blocks, but you're going to make them together, you're not really going to separate them during fermentations. You can kind of take a sample of the whole vineyard, regardless of clone or even field blend. If you do a field blend of Grenache and Syrah and Mourvedre or something like that, you could still take samples of all that blend and sample it together. But if you are like we do our fermentations pretty specifically by block. So we'll go through each block and sample it separately at times. And when we're doing this, Chris, we did this back in 2017 when I was the harvest intern. The idea is to try to get as a random sample as possible. So you're walking through rows of the block, but you want to basically pick different sides of the vine. We talked about the other day how the sun will rise and you'll get that morning sun and energy during the first part of the day, and then it might be more shaded on the other side. Well, those clusters will also have different ripenings or different characteristics based on which side of the vine they ripen on. So picking samples, you're going to be picking from both sides of the row. So you'll walk down and take one from the more shaded side, from the more sunny side. On each individual cluster, you're also taking grapes from maybe the bottom of the cluster, in the middle, up on top, because a cluster of grapes will ripen differently too. Sometimes you'll have more sun hitting the tops of the clusters, so those grapes on top might be a little riper than the ones underneath that are a little more shaded. You're also walking and taking samples at different points along the row. It's particularly important when you have a slope, or if you're on a hillside, that you pick at different parts of the slope as well. Whether that's this way, so you have rows going along the slope this way, you want to make sure you're taking from every other row or so you can get grapes that might get a little more water than vines that are higher up on the slope. So basically, yeah, just doing that. And Chris also says the best way to do it is honestly not looking, because we are just biased in when we go through and look at grapes and want to pick grapes, in that you'll usually pick the ones that look the best, that look riper, that look nicer. But that can give you false information when you go back to test everything, because you are picking the ripest, nicest berries, when in reality there could be a bunch that are kind of maybe softer or smaller, or maybe they're a little more shriveled or something. And so he said the best way is just, see a cluster and then kind of like close your eyes or look away and just feel around and pick a couple berries and throw them in the bag. And at this point, you want to get a good enough sample, like you'll see on the right, those two Ziploc bags, that you can crush it, get juice out of it, and then you're analyzing this for certain things like acid levels. So our pH level, you measure Brix to figure out your sugar level. You can also do certain tests for phenolic compounds, for tannins and things like that. I don't know if we really rely on that as much from a lab point of view. The other thing, which I didn't actually put in here, but one of the most important things to do while sampling, is literally just tasting berries. And so while you're sampling, you want to squeeze berries and look at them. You want to see and look at what the color of the seeds are, because if the seeds are still bright green, that means that they haven't fully lignified yet, that the tannins might not be ripe enough. Whereas if they turn a little yellow or a little brown, that's an indication that the grape is fully ripe. But you also want to be tasting. When you taste the grapes, are you getting a good balance of acidity and sugar and tannin? And so that's a super important part as well. But you can also use lab analysis to look at things like that. And then lastly, one of the important things we've had to deal with recently, luckily not this year, is analyzing for any sort of smoke taint or smoke particles in years when we have forest fires or other things affecting us. Again, this year was beautiful. We didn't really worry about that much. But this would be a time too where you could get some idea of what percentage of your grape juice or your grapes might be affected by things like smoke. And so then after going through, we're sampling, they've done the color pass, our vineyard team has done their best to make sure that the vineyards are looking great, that the grapes are ready to be picked. And during this time is also a very logistical challenge. And so between Chris and John and other members of our team, and Dick Boucher and Justin, his assistant, and a lot of the people on the vineyard side, is just coordination of bins and coordination of space. So we'll basically, again, our estate vineyard is out here in Eastern Washington, about 3.5 hours away from our winery in Woodinville. So we have to rely on trucks to bring bins over, to bring fruit back. And so it does take a lot of planning. So the best way to do this is through sampling, and through our vineyard team, we'll get an estimation of our yields. And we kind of talked about this when talking about grape ripeness as well, that counting through your clusters per vine, weighing your clusters at certain times during the season, especially closer to when you pick it, you can get an idea of how much fruit you're going to be getting, how much tonnage you'll be getting based on the yield per acreage. That's all really important to know at this point, because now we're making decisions of, okay, how many fruit bins are we sending to each vineyard or to each block? How big are those bins? There's different sizes of fruit pick bins, ones that are a little shallower, some that are much deeper, but also making sure that all of them are cleaned and ready to go. And that should be done, a month before when we hire our harvest intern. But trying to figure out how much is coming to each block before harvest date. And so roughly we're talking about 2 bins. So these pick bins will roughly hold about 2 bins per ton of fruit. In reality, sometimes it's like 2.5 bins to get a ton of fruit based on how much weight each cluster has. But that's kind of how you can predict how many bins we're going to need at that sort of 3 to 4 tons per acre amount. In older vines, like I think some of these blocks might have been more like 2.5 tons per acre, or or less. When it gets down to 2 or less, that's when you're talking about, oh, is this enough yield to keep this vineyard going? And a lot of times that's when vines will be ripped up and replaced with newer vines. But shooting for 3 to 4 tons per acre is sort of the sweet spot for us here. So you're coordinating, making sure that you have enough bins there. At the same time, and John has been a wizard for the last few years doing this, is also figuring out how do they prepare the cellar, how do they prepare the winery to take in all the fruit they're going to have. So coordinating space both on the trucks, because you can only fit a certain amount of pallets or a certain amount of these bins in an actual truck. Coordinating how much fermenter space you need. We use these square stainless steel fermenters for a lot of our red ferments that will fit roughly 4 pick bins. And then each one of those fermenters will roughly press out to about 4 barrels or 4 of those barrique barrels, and with 2 barrels per rack. Basically, this whole thing is a giant puzzle in trying to figure out how much, based on how much fruit we think we're getting, how can we organize the cellar? How can we organize the winery to make sure we have enough vessels to ferment in, enough vessels to age things in? It's pretty amazing, and also, a nightmare at the same time to see, especially this year. Again, we with the delay in our vintage, with the cooler spring and hot summer, everything got pushed a little later and later, but then it all kind of condensed all at once. So we were picking Merlot and Grenache and other varieties that might be picked a little earlier. At the same time, we were picking Cabernet, some Syrah, and others that usually you have a few weeks in between, and at this time they're all happening at the same time. I talked to, we'll get to that in a second. So the decision to harvest is basically, we've done our samples. We've figured out our sugar level, acid level, phenolics taste good. Everything is optimal to be picked. And so then it's about Chris, our winemaker, coordinating with Dick Boucher, our grower, to make sure that we can schedule out when these things are being picked. Our vineyard growers are very active and very busy. They manage a lot of the other vineyards on Red Mountain, as well as the Boucher vineyard, which is near towards Grandview. And so coordinating your team, their picking teams, and making sure that they can actually get everything picked in a day is quite a chore. I actually asked Justin the other day, usually during harvest, the team will pick about 10 tons, maybe 15 tons a day of fruits, which is a lot, which is a whole lot. But usually that could be, starting early in the morning and going to midday, they can get about that much done. They've recently been doing 30 to 35 tons a day for the last few weeks in a row. They've been so busy just because, again, everything has been very condensed. So that scheduling can be really tricky sometimes. It's because you want to make sure that you can get things picked when you want them picked, but also you have to work around the schedules of everyone involved. And of course, that can also be changed last minute due to weather events. Luckily, we didn't have any major rain. We had some rain about a week ago, but we were picking far enough afterwards that we didn't really worry about too much water being soaked up and diluting those grapes before we got them. So harvest, it's crazy. These teams, though, are just incredible workers. They start very early in the morning, right at sunrise. Sometimes before sunrise, you'll see other vineyards, maybe in California or other places, that will bring in lights, and they'll actually pick when it's still dark out, because they want to make sure they retain those acidity if it is going to be warm that day. We've lucked out that it's still been pretty cool during the day, that we haven't had to worry about that as much, but they're still starting early because they want to keep the fruit cold. As soon as fruit's taken off the vine, it'll start oxidizing. Like as soon as it's no longer attached to its mother plant, reactions start taking place. And when you have grapes coming up and they're pressing down on the grapes, you will get some that will start to crush or will break, and some of that juice will even start some of the process that you really want to wait till later. So keeping the temperature down helps to prevent anything from getting out of hand. All these are picked by hand. So the way that this works, at least with our team, is you have workers that work in pairs, and a lot of times they are couples. And so one of them will be, like she's doing right now, zipping through and taking off every single grape And then the others will be picking up those little yellow bins and carrying them over and empty them into a larger bin on a tractor. Every time they do that too, they'll call out the name of the picker, and they'll have their lead there with a clipboard, and she's making a tally of every bin that picker picks, and it's a way that they can keep track so that they know how the labor's divided and how they're progressing. And then so when full bins are filled up, they're taken and they're stacked to be weighed basically before we transport them. So we have, when you come up, you'll see our big turnaround. It's a really convenient place to be able to store all of our bins so that we can weigh them. And this again is assisting John and Chris and our wine team by knowing exactly how much weight of fruit we have, which can tell us more or less what volume of fruit we have and how much space we're going to need in the winery to process it all. So we'll weigh them about two bins at a time. We tear out the bin weight. Each of our bins are about 104 pounds each. And then each bin is labeled with the vineyard name, the block name, the variety, and then the weight per bin. Since we're doing 2 at a time, we basically divide it by 2, even though that might not be the exact amount. And we communicate that with our team so they know how things are being weighed. But then basically they are loaded into the truck as soon as possible. So this was actually one of the days that was pretty nice because right when we were weighing, the truck showed up, so we were able to get them weighed and loaded up and sent off. Every once in a while, again, because scheduling can be such a nightmare, you'll have fruit that's either been picked and it's waiting to be picked up for hours and just sitting there. Sometimes you'll have trucks that get there a couple hours early and will sometimes take fruit before we can label it, or they have to be weighed because they get a packing slip printed out that they have to use legally to carry any freight like any other truck. But it's just, yeah, it's a pretty interesting process. But now I wanted to go through, I debated how much detail to get into about wine making, about this stage of the process, because I feel like that could be a whole other class on its own. You could spend many, many days, many weeks talking about vinification, the wine, from when you get those grapes and turning them into wine. But this is also what we're doing now. So I wanted to give you a little idea of the next process. How are we getting these grapes eventually into barrel? These are some Sauvignon Blanc grapes from last year or the year before that were arriving and awaiting the next step, which for whites is pressing immediately, but for reds is going through a crush pad. So again, I might zoom through this. We'll geek out a little bit on some of the details, but if questions pop up, that's great, and I can answer some questions, but we'll also be able to ask more of those when Chris and Dick are here, or if we do a future course on just the winemaking process. But when we get those reds, so we put them on the truck, all the Cabernet or Merlot or those red grapes get sent to the winery. They're usually stored overnight in our cellar, and just let them sit in a cold space because crushing will usually happen the following morning. So we set up a crush pad. I'm sorry that I don't have a picture of the whole thing. It's hard to get an idea of how it's all laid out, but more or less, the first process is you grab a bin of grapes, you raise it up and throw it into a cluster sorter. So this is a huge bin and the whole thing is shaking. Everything shakes because you want to knock off any rocks or leaves or anything while you're sorting. And then you'll go through and sort clusters like you would in the vineyard. If you have a cluster that's maybe not fully ripened and there's a bunch of red berries as opposed to dark bluish purple, or if you have that Milleron d'Age, you have some uneven ripening. If you have, of course, any rot or any issues like that, you take them out. You're taking out leaves, anything you see that's other than grapes. There's actually a term called MOG or MOG, which is material other than grapes. You want to remove that from the batch of wines, and then it gets pushed into this crusher destemmer. So this middle picture right here, or the left picture, is the crusher destemmer. You can't really tell, but if it goes over here, there's a little the bin that they'll be poured down to here. They'll go through this. This is a huge rotating barrel-like process that will rip out the rachis, so all these stems will fall and be pushed out into this side, and all the berries will go through these little holes and then drop through these rollers right here, and they'll drop right into either the sorting table or this elevator. And basically the sorting table works like this. So they've dropped in, they've gone through rollers that are crushing the berries. And we call this crush because of this moment. They're not completely crushing berries, because again, you don't want to crush seeds and get those weird tannins. You just want to basically rip the skins apart or burst the berries. And so the rollers will do that, and then they go through this whole cluster sorts. You'll have different people on other sides of the table, or not cluster sort, sorry, berry sorting. You'll pulling jacks, any of those stems left over, all eyes on deck. This fruit looks really great. This is definitely not Merlot, because Merlot is notoriously full of stems and jacks, and so you need a lot of hands there to get it all sorted out. So after that, it goes through this elevator and goes right into a fermenter, which we'll see in a minute. If there are whites, I didn't really get into this, but whites were basically just pressed immediately. We don't need to crush them or destem them. They are just put into our press. We get the juice off as quick as possible because we don't want it to oxidize, and then put it into barrels or concrete eggs for fermentation. And so fermentation, so these little, I think they're old alfalfa bins, or some other agriculture, or some other farmers will use these for seed bins or something. But the Washington wine industry has used these for a long time for fermenting. They're really great vessels for it. And so we do most of our fermentations in these stainless steel fermenters. So real quick on fermentation, alcoholic fermentation occurs when yeasts, which is part of the fungi family, feed on sugars, and they break them down with help from enzymes to produce alcohol, carbon dioxide, and then heat. Those are the main results from fermentation. That main yeast strain, or that species that we see in brewing of all types, is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's also used in baking and beer, but it is the most common yeast. There are other yeasts that will come into play that can be part of the wine making process. Like in Spain, the whole idea of aging sherry wines, or making sherry wines under a flor. It's called flor, is a yeast film. It's a different strain of yeast, but that's a very specific thing. For the most part, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the main yeast here. And we do, for Avennia wines, we actually do all native fermentations or natural fermentations. And so basically what that is we're just relying on the yeast that are coming off of the vines, that are on the grapes. You can even see sometimes they're cloudy, and you can rub off the clouds. A lot of times that's yeast on the grapes, or even just the microflora and yeast that are still around in the winery from previous years. And so the whole process to start fermentation, when you're relying on native yeast, might take a little bit longer. And so what we do, we use dry ice, or that frozen like CO2 ice cubes, to protect from oxidation. We'll throw those on top of the fermenter, and it creates this cloud of CO2 to protect in that first part as fermentation gets going. And at that time too, that we keep those fermenters pretty tightly sealed. You'll see on these rows, these are all in different stages of fermentation. So these bins on the right that have the plastic, and you can kind of tell they're bungee corded around. So they're secured pretty tightly. That's because those are freshly starting to ferment. We don't want a lot of oxygen to get in. We want to protect them as they go through this process. Whereas these black tops are actually mesh tops. So they're a little looser, they allow a little more air in. But at this time, these are further along in fermentation. There's enough CO2 being generated by that fermentation that you don't have to worry as much about oxygen, because there's CO2 sort of just hovering on top of the cap. And throughout this whole time, we're taking measurements on the temperature, making sure that our temperatures don't dip down and we can get stuck fermentations. We're doing Brix measurements to slowly watch that sugar content go down. So we'll slowly watch ABV, the amount of alcohol, go up, and just test those regularly to make sure they're progressing. And this is those ice cubes I was talking about. So we throw in these little CO2 dry ice, and that helps form that CO2 layer to keep those grapes protected. And then basically as fermentation picks up, a cap of solids, which is those skins, some pulps, and the stems, will rise to the top. They'll have those carbon dioxide molecules will turn into bubbles, and they'll just basically go into the skins, and everything floats up. And it helps make this cap. But the problem with the cap is you want to keep it wet. If you don't keep the cap wet, You could get the acetic bacteria, which would form acetic acid, which would basically turn your wine into vinegar. No one wants that. And so to keep that wet, and I talked about this last week as well, there's different ways of cap management or punch downs. We basically do manual punch downs, and that's what this picture is. This is Miles, our harvest intern, and then in the background you can see John doing some punch downs in one of our huge concrete tanks, which, man, that must be a workout. But they basically get up on the sides of these fermenting bins, and you want to manually punch down this pole with a flat disc on the bottom, and you're just trying to mix it up and keep things wet. And it's doing a lot of things. It's keeping things wet to prevent unwanted things, but it also is helping to extract flavor and color components from those skins and phenolics and all the things that will make our wine really interesting. And the warmer temperature also helps that, so it's sort of the combo of mixing it together, macerating, but also having that warmer temperature from fermentation that'll help extract all of that really great color and flavor. And then I mentioned before too, we do our punch downs manually like this. There's other versions and ways that you can do cap management. So through whether it's pumping the wine from the bottom of the tank onto the top and sort of splashing the cap. You can empty the whole bin and just put it into a new bin. Some producers will have these screens that they literally just force down over the top of it to kind of like push the cap down so it never pops up. It just sort of forces it there to keep wet. And so yeah, there's different ways of doing it. We've always done this by hand. It's a little more artisan way of doing things. It's a way you can be really careful that you're not crushing pips or anything to extract harsher tannins or doing anything, or basically it's just a little more careful. And this is done twice a day, first thing in the morning and then usually 12 hours later. And then after that fermentation period is complete, when the bricks have gone down to 0 or negative bricks measurements even, and the ABV is at a good spot, we can press each of these fermentation bins you can see there, use the forklift, bring it up, we pour it into this pneumatic bladder press. So you can see this large drum here. I don't know how much it holds. That'll be a good question to ask because I forget how much, but you can fill this whole drum with all the juice, all the skins, that cap, everything goes in there. And then for a while, you're just going to get free run juice. So this video is basically a lot of that juice just instantly going down, or the wine instantly going down into the pan below. I like this video too. It's a little spookier because of the dry ice that we put in it. Again, help protect from oxygen. But then after free run, we turn this on. This will start rotating, and then inside there's a bladder that'll be expanded and then press against all the solids and all the skins to get even more juice out. And there's definitely levels. We talk about free run juice, which is free run, which is your instant, all the liquid that's coming out. Your next press, which you'll get a lot of the others, extract even more phenolics and even more flavor and tannins. And then there's a final press, which a lot of times you want to avoid. They'll use that a lot of times for vinegar or for spirit production, because it can be even more harsh when you're crushing, and that might be when you crush seeds or other things that you get harsher tannins out. It's a little more important, I think, in white wine making. When you do that, free run is sort of the most beautiful selection. It's what champagne houses are prized after, is using free run juice. Then you press a little bit more to get some more. But with white wines, you want to avoid a lot of phenolics, so they won't do as much press at the end. After that, wine is pumped into barrels. And then before they're put away, you would leave those barrels. And again, barrels for most of our wines, sometimes we pump them into concrete tanks, which is a little different. But if they are in barrels and we want them to go through malolactic fermentation, we just basically leave them in a warmer room. And malolactic fermentation, also known as secondary fermentation, different than your secondary re-fermentation in sparkling wine like champagne. This is a different process, so it's not converting sugars into alcohol again, it's converting malic acid into lactic acid. That's where we get the malolactic name from. And this is done through bacteria. Lactobacillus is one of the main ones, but also, I can't pronounce it, Leoconostoc and Pediococcus are some other bacteria that are just naturally present in fermenting wine. And the malic acid is that really harsh green tasting acid. Think of a Granny Smith apple. It's also, when you walk through before Verizon and you try grapes, that's malic acid. That's super high tartness and green and super bitter. And we want to convert that into lactic acid, that acid you find in milk or sour cream and things like that. And so it's a much softer tasting, it's a much softer feel on the mouth. And so in order to do that, we need a little higher temperature, because that's how the bacteria will work and start converting those acids. If it's too cold, it won't work, it'll stop. And then also, sulfur dioxide will also kill this bacteria. So we avoid adding any sulfur at this point, because we want to have that ml. And this is for most of our red wines. For white wines, you can kind of choose to do ml or not. When you think of a really buttery Chardonnay, diacetyl is that buttery flavor, which is a natural result of malolactic fermentation. And so that's a stylistic choice. It's a style that you want to have that richness and that softer mouthfeel. But then for some wines like Sauvignon Blanc or Riesling, you might choose to avoid ml, where you want that acidity. You want to keep that original acidity in the wine. And the way to do that, again, if you want to prevent it, you can just add sulfur dioxide, keep it cooler so that this process won't happen naturally. And the one thing I learned that I didn't realize is that this process also releases carbon dioxide. So apparently back in the day, before they knew what ml was, before malolactic, they called it a second fermentation, because they would bottle something before it went through ml, but all of a sudden those bottles would be a little fizzy when they would open them up when it got warmer again, because it wasn't necessarily that yeasts were being, I mean, it could have been both, because back then they weren't filtering or anything, but it wasn't necessarily because there was yeast converting into more sugar into more alcohol, but there is release of carbon dioxide gas during this acid transition. So we use bungs, these plugs that go in each barrel that have a little lip on them to let gas out during this time. And then basically after that, when it goes through, you replace the bung with a harder bung so that there is no air getting out. And then we can move the barrels into the cellar and basically begin the whole élevage period, or this raising period, the aging period. And this we put some in the combination of new barrels, those toasted French oak barrels, some barrels that we've used in previous vintages that are now considered neutral or used barrels. Again, some in concrete eggs, concrete tanks. We have larger oak tanks, and then basically getting them to slowly age over the next year or two before we start blending. And there's other things involved like batonnage. Again, there's so much that happens at this point that I could go off. I've already probably talked too long about this, but that's okay. That can be saved for another time. So then lastly, basically now we've gone through and picked everything out of the vineyard. So at this time in the vineyard, there's a few things we can still do to make sure that the vineyard is shut down basically right, and that we're preparing it for even next year. It's important to make sure that most of the fruit is dropped, and that's usually done during harvest anyway. That you can see there's one little cluster there that should still be dropped, but for the most part, you want to drop all the fruit, because if fruit is left on the vine, you can risk getting some other fungal issues or mold or other diseases, because a lot of times certain bugs and pests will be attracted to that rotting fruit on the vine, and they can get to the trunk. So it's better to have that dropped onto the floor. It's also a good time for weed management if you're worried about weeds growing in between rows. You can repair infrastructure. A lot of people say this is a good time to apply fertilizer or compost to give the vines that last bit of nutrients. Remember when we talked about dormancy, the vines are in the process of shutting down, and so it's taking as much nutrients and water and storing it as carbohydrates in their woody parts, in the trunks, in the roots, and the cordons, so that it can use it next year between bud break and flowering when it's not getting a lot of nutrients from the sun. So this is the time to give it that last little bit boost of energy to hold on to throughout the winter. And you can also continue to irrigate at this time too. It still needs a little bit of water, particularly if it's not starting to rain. And then there's not much of an update on our new blocks. I took this picture a week ago. I just thought it was really pretty afternoon, evening. But you can see this is our annex block actually. So Vines are definitely growing up out of those grow tubes. They're starting, you can see some of these leaves are starting to turn a little yellow. So they're getting to that point where they will also start going into dormancy, into their first dormancy, which is very exciting. I'm particularly interested to, and I'll prep a few questions for Dick when we're here next weekend, because I'm interested to see what's going to happen with these blocks next. And I actually don't know, because I know certain things we talked about. We're going to be lifting grow tubes, and over winter they're going to prune things and finally start establishing what the vine shape is going to be, which is super exciting. But it'll be interesting to see what we're going to do now in the vineyard moving forward over the next month. But that's basically it. So, like I said, only 9 days until field trip day. So exciting. Keep an eye out. I know that Shelly sent you an email. I think all of you responded with lunch choice, which is fantastic. It also is looking a little like it's going to be a little chilly, potentially maybe a little wet. I mean, weather can always change, but I would just basically be prepared for any types of weather, because we do plan on getting out there, walking through the vineyard and doing some things outside. So other than that, though, that marks the end of our 4-week class here. So, ta-da! I don't know how to celebrate with a little bit of wine. I'm drinking a little Syrah here, so. But yeah, it's funny. I started reading about like all these different yeast strains and like how oxygen affects the process, and sulfur, and I was like, you know what, it might get a little too in depth too in depth for my brain, but also I think that could be a future class to do a little more deep dive into winemaking. So whereas this was a vineyard.
Okay, I was just interested in the part where during crush you said, well, you can tell these aren't Merlot grapes because there's not a lot of stems, and so they're a different kind of grape to deal with than other grapes.
Yeah, well, it's more because we deal with Merlot and Cabernet. I just kind of assumed that was probably Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet Franc, and that's more just from experience helping with sorting. Every year, Merlot, as a variety, Merlot, and I don't know what it is physically about the grape, but even when it's destemmed, it tends to hold on to a lot of their stems in each berry. And so it's hard to get the berries off the stems. And I don't know whether that's just a surface tension thing, or just that they're particularly attached to their pedicel. Is that what the name of the little stem is? And so when we're sorting Merlot days, when you are crushing, are the days where you want 6 or 7 people just on the sorting table. And the other reason for that too, with grapes like Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, Carmenere, any of these grapes that are in the Bordeaux family, the Bordeaux varieties, those have higher concentrations of that pyrazine, the methoxypyrazine we talked about, that gives that green flavor to wines. And even though we want some of that in the wine, if you have too many stems that will have loads of pyrazine in them in the fermentation, you'll get more than you want. Whereas stems with Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, some of the Rhone varieties that we work with, stems aren't as loaded with pyrazine. You don't have to worry as much about that super green bell pepper green note that you can get in wines, you might get the more herbal like bay leaf and thyme and rosemary from stems with Syrah and Grenache. But you're just less concerned in general about stems getting the fermenters. So Merlot days were like the most crucial days for sorting, because we want to remove as many stems as possible, because it's a Bordeaux variety with lots of pyrazines, but also Merlot tends to hold on to stems more than Cabernet and Cabernet Franc. And then we could just call them jacks, because they look like jacks, like the old game of jacks and ball, because they're just all like little X's and little clusters. So, but yeah.
I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
So sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, Deanne's up on an airplane, and I was sending her some texts as she's flying. She's wanted you to know she's enjoying a Paso Robles red
Nice. Very
on
good.
the flight. But she had asked me, and I didn't know if I missed hearing it or not, but when do the sulfites get added into that process?
Yeah, good question.
Why?
Yeah, so sulfur dioxide, like when we talked in malolactic, sulfur will kill bacteria. which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because there's certain bacteria like lactobacillus during ML that we do want and we don't want to mess with. But then there's also harsher bacteria we want to avoid, or other issues that you do want to protect the wine from. So usually, you're talking sulfur. So sulfur is added, we add sulfur, I'm getting confused, because there's CO2 and then there's sulfur. We add the dry ice at different times, which we talked about. Sulfur we add right when we put grapes in the fermenter. So after sorting, and you get a whole pile of grapes, and then sulfur, which, you know what, I'll do a little more digging, and we can talk about it more with Chris and Dick, because he'll be a much better resource for that. But sulfur is added, I know it's added at the beginning of fermentation, again, to protect from bacteria or any things that grow on top before it can form a cap, before it can create its own carbon dioxide. And then it's not added again usually until after ML, like it's put in barrel, and then we add it again just before bottling, I want to say. Like it's not so many times that you want to add sulfur, because sulfur will also strip color away. It's funny when you put sulfur in because when you have grapes that have been crushed, they've gone through the sorting table, they get up the elevator into the fermenter, you'll already start seeing sort of a pink hue to the juice, because it's starting to crush, it's starting to extract some color. And as soon as you put sulfur on it, you mix sulfur with a little water, it'll bleach it and it'll turn clear, basically. So you also want to be careful with when you're adding sulfur, because you can bleach color compounds. But it's a great question though, and I didn't.
So it's all about killing the bacteria that could potentially destroy the wine. Yeah,
it's basically like more of a preservative. And you can use sulfur. There's, again, the whole sulfur and sulfites thing is, I still don't necessarily understand how it all works, but I do know that a lot of wineries are also using nitrogen as an alternative to using sulfur at different parts of the process. They'll use nitrogen before bottling or at different times, and it acts a little differently, because nitrogen it's not as heavy, I think, because nitrogen is more like oxygen, same. So the way it acts in vessels is different than sulfur. But yeah, those are all great questions that I don't know the answers to.
All right, we'll ask a lot when we're there, I'm sure.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So I have a question about the sulfur. If sulfur stops malolactic fermentation and you want to have malolactic fermentation, if you add it in the beginning of initial fermentation, excuse me, it must dissipate at some point, because if you're going to start malolactic, if you have sulfur, you're not going to have, you want those bacteria, right?
Yeah.
You want certain bacteria?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's true. I think by the time fermentation's done, that initial dose of sulfur is either transformed into other compounds or other things, or it's dissolved. Yeah, like you said. I'm not necessarily sure how much it affects, because I know that that's pretty standard to add sulfur before fermentations. And then if you did want to prevent malo or ML, then you would also add sulfur then. So yeah, but I'm not sure, because the thing is, the very simple way of thinking about fermentation is the basic chemical compounds of yeast plus sugar, like plus glucose or fructose, and you can see the chemical, how it breaks down, equals carbon dioxide plus ethanol plus heat, but there's so many other reactions taking place too, because of certain bacterias or other aromatic or other enzyme enzymatics reactions that I'm sure sulfur atoms find ways to go other places. Then it'd be interesting to know sort of where that goes or what happens to it.
It's funny, because you want to protect it from certain bacteria, and yet when you do malolactic, you need bacteria to do the malolactic.
Yeah, there's a lot of a similar kind of what's it called, like a conundrum in winemaking, because the other big one is oxygen, and I think there's whole books written about how oxygen is both absolutely critical for wine and its downfall. It's the winemaking could honestly be said to just be in how do you control oxygen in the process, because you want oxygen even in fermentations. You actually need, so even though we use the dry ice and put a layer of CO2 on top of the must, sometimes yeast will actually need oxygen to reproduce. So if you have yeast that's struggling to get going, one of the things they say you can do is oxidize it. And they actually have machines where you can pump it and throw it over these waterfalls almost to aerate the must before it's fermenting, because you need oxygen to help the yeast. But at the same time, you want to protect the wine from oxygen because of oxidation, of getting too much. And that goes through the whole process, whether it's in the fermentation stage or in the aging phase. Because the reason we age in barrels is because we want a little bit of oxygen, that micro-oxygenation to develop flavors and to develop the wine. But then too much of it will oxidize, and you'll get those brown flavors or other things. So it's fascinating just how oxygen is basically killing all of us, but at the same time we're surviving because of it. So. The same conundrum happens in wine.
It's such a fine line. I mean, it really, when you hear about this, you really come to understand that it is an art. Yeah. Because you really have to be attuned to what's happening, and it's. Yeah. Thank you I wish, I can't see myself ever making it. I mean, I love drinking it, but boy, I don't think I could handle the stress.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think because I've always thought of winemakers as equal parts scientists and artists and artists. And I think you're right, because you have to have the understanding of the science, but a lot of times it's reactionary too about what's happening. And
it's a gut reaction. I mean, it's kind of a gut decision.
Totally. And style decision too. Like thinking about ML, you can decide that you want to have your wines go through that because you want a softer wine, or you can decide, especially with Chardonnay, I think even though we don't make Chardonnay, that's where it's, I think, interesting, because you definitely have producers that will swear by ML in their Chardonnay because they want richness, they want that buttery flavor. And actually, one of the side note, and I think I put this in the slide, but I didn't really mention it, but that buttery flavor, diacetyl, it actually is created during ML on a bell curve. And so the amount of diacetyl that results from that malic acid to lactic acid conversion increases over time. And then it actually starts decreasing again, because after it reaches its apex, it'll start being consumed and then start going down into nothing. So if a wine is fully ML'd, if you ever see a wine that says full ML, or full malolactic, it actually won't have much buttery flavor at all. It's when it's partial ML, when they stop it, when it reaches its apex of diacetyl.
Oh, wow.
That's when you get that buttery flavor. So because I always see if something has full malolactic, you expect it to be even more buttery, but actually it'll be less buttery than a partial ML.
Wow, I gotta remember that.
I didn't know that either. So if it's full ML, it just means it's not as harsh.
Yeah,
it won't necessarily have buttery flavor, but won't have that, it'll just be not harsh, less harsh.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Yep. So back to I don't know why I'm stuck on ice wine. You say shutting down the vineyard and making sure all the passed over fruit is dropped. So in the case, if you're in an area where you want to make ice wine, you want fruit to stay there, right? So it freezes and does its thing. But then for future growth and things like that, I mean, I wonder how many times you can actually make ice wine from a given vine.
Yeah, that's
before it starts going okay, you know what, I'm done.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would imagine that they're also doing multiple passes before ice wine is harvested to remove anything that seems like a problem, because especially when that's something that's that delicate and that you're taking the risk by leaving it on the vine longer than you think.
Right.
But oh yeah, but no, that's a great question. I don't have any experience with ice wine other than trying some from Canada that were amazing. So it's hard to.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor it. I'm just fascinated how that all works.
Yeah.
As compared to the usual wines that we drink.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's great.
You know, another thing that came, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot.
No,
Tell me to
please
shut up
do.
if that's the case.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
You know, what occurred to me when you were talking about like trucking the wine, you know, you harvest and then you load it and you get it to the, you know, production facility as soon as possible. You guys use vineyards across the state. So I'm sure that's got to be, you know, talk about logistics and things like that and all these trucks heading over to Woodinville. Interesting how that is compared to, say, estate wines, where the wines are grown on site and, you know, you've got them right there.
Yeah.
So somehow that's a little bit easier, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to even being around while we're making wine and seeing some of the other vineyards harvest. It's interesting to see just the difference between how they're transporting grapes. Because we have, you know, for instance, Kiona, one of our neighbors down the hill on Sunset, they have vineyards up near us where they're picking, but then they basically don't need to put it in a truck because they're only going down the street. So they'll just have open flatbed trucks that can just be loaded up. They bring it down to the winery, process it, and go up, which is just a different problem than having like, oh no, we need, you know, not refrigerated trucks, but just like closed trucks that will actually make the trek across. But you're right, like logistically, there's definitely been times where, you know, there's many, I think Chris and maybe, I don't know, Ron Dees could vouch for this too, like he's on the phone a lot during harvest because it's all, hey, how many bins are at this vineyard? Oh, we need to bring 2 of those bins actually to this other block that's being picked tomorrow because you're not being picked for 5 days. And then it's, oh, schedule, make sure the truck is there at this time to pick up this fruit from this vineyard. But oh no, there's a delay in the picking team at the other vineyard we're picking from, and so you have to like solve it. It's a lot.
Does he do that on his own, or does he have a team? Like, how do you?
I think a lot of it's Chris. I mean, Chris has amazing capacity to keep all this information in his head too, which is incredible. But I honestly, sometimes I think it almost has to be one person because there's so many moving parts. I think sharing, and I'm sure other wineries have different ways of doing this.
Right.
But
I guess it'd be like air traffic control, you know?
It's a good way to.
And like where I work, we have to have salt delivered. We have a need for salt. So when we have the supplier ship us salt, they send us this tracking program so you can watch exactly where the truck is at any given moment. So I wonder if Chris has something like a big screen TV and
like multiple monitors.
Yeah.
Maybe by next year we'll get it.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, you know.
But it is. It's a whole other talent to be able to do the logistical planning side of it for sure. Yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so how big are these teams that pick? You know, again, hand picking, and I look at these huge vineyards and I'm like, how do people do this? How many people do you need to go through and take care of that fruit in a day?
Totally. Well, it totally depends on, because you can have smaller teams do a block and it'll just take them longer. So there's been times where we've had only a dozen pickers go through and do a smaller block. And then there's been other times where maybe they need a whole, you know, 4 or 5 acres picked and they have to do it really fast. So they'll send maybe 30 people up here to do it. And then there'll be 2 tractors with 2 bins each on the front and back going down the vineyard slowly as they pick, being just all the yellow bins being pulled in. So it's, it's a lot.
I can imagine being like that intern that's, okay, we're going to teach you how to pick, you know, and it's like, how do you know, I mean, it takes some time to develop that skill, I'm sure. And I don't know that I would want to be the newbie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That'll be a good question for Dick too. I actually don't know how, because I know he's had certain workers that have been with him for a long time, and I wonder what the process is like for training new workers and how, you know, how that goes.
I'll try and remember to ask him that because I'm so impressed by that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Did anyone have any other questions before we wrap things up?
So I was looking at the picture of the final kind of cleaning or pruning or whatever before it goes. So are the people that do that the same people that pick, or are these 2 different groups of people? Usually,
that's a good question. I think usually they are. And part of that is because I think Boucher has 2 general teams, the Boucher Vineyard one in Grandview, and then the Red Mountain team. Because the bulk of the vineyards he manages are either there or here. And I'm pretty sure that he has a lot of the same people that will work just on Red Mountain, or a lot of people that just work in Grandview. So I've definitely seen a lot of the same people who have come through to do different passes, the color pass, they'll do harvest, they'll do pruning, they'll do all of it. But then I also know, like, especially with pruning, and I think I mentioned this, that he has like his A team and B, you know, he has teams that are like, oh, these are the ones I trust the most to do pruning, as opposed to doing other tasks that might not be as crucial. So, yeah.
So do you, go ahead, Dave.
Oh,
So I was just saying, it's fascinating, you know, all the different
Oh,
steps in this. I think today there was like 12 different steps in this process, you know, and fascinating.
Yeah.
yeah, it makes you really, I have a new appreciation. I mean, I appreciate it, but I have a new appreciation.
Oh yeah, no, I do too. It's being here this year. You like, and I'm not even saying this because, you know, I think our wines are. I mean, I think our wines are great, and I think they are a great price, and they can be an investment in some ways. But I'm also like, wine can be expensive for a reason, and I think like the amount of stuff that goes into making wine is so much more. You know, I'll see ads all the time about, oh, this bottle only costs $3 to make, and they're selling it to you for $60, and like, oh, I can give you a better margin. And I'm just like, you know, it's so much more than that. So, and I think this whole course hopefully showed why, you know, there's a lot going into it. So
It's awesome.
yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you all one more time for being with me for the last 4 weeks. I'm so excited again to see you all in person and get to do more stuff, to do a little more learning, to actually taste some wine together, to see the vineyard and get some more questions answered, hopefully. So yeah, thank you all so much. And if there's no other questions, I will look forward to seeing you in about 9 days. Again, you'll still get some more information from us over the next few days or next week. But also if you guys have any questions or issues, even just about planning the day or planning your trip here or anything, please reach out to us and we can help you out. So
where's everybody coming from? I mean,
oh, good question.
I'm like local, but are you guys all on the other side?
Some Yakima, some.
We're from Yakima.
Yeah.
Yep. Bellevue.
From Spokane.
Oh, wow.
We are in the Tri-Cities.
Yeah, Jenny and Brian in Tri-City.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure where Jenna is.
I'm coming from Seattle.
From Seattle. Oh, great.
Yeah. And Beth Kurtz is she and I are friends. She's in Kennewick, so I'm gonna be staying with her and
cool.
making the trip out there for the weekend.
Oh, that'll be
fun.
That's fun. Cool.
Oh, that's great. And that's another thing I'm really excited about is bringing our East Side people and our West Side together. So that'll
Absolutely.
Well, you did an excellent job. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
thank you. It's been great.
Great. Well, I'll get this video edited and sent out on Monday like usual. So keep an eye out for that. And then I will see you all in a little over a week.
All right.
What's for
Go
dinner?
Shirley, hi.
Oh, Aislinn was just here today, our chef, and we went through we were doing a final tasting, and she showed me her menu. I don't want to give it away though.
Okay, fair enough.
But it's gonna be so good. I also spent a good couple hours cracking walnuts from our walnut tree that will make an appearance.
Oh,
I have some raisins that I dried from our table grapes that will be making an appearance in the meal.
oh my gosh.
That's going to be really cool.
Local produce and local farms for things as possible, but then also hyper local, like actually ingredients from their property. So
Awesome.
it'll be a lot of fun.
Yay.
So,
Great.
awesome.
Can't
Well,
wait.
we'll see you all
Thank
soon. Thank
Cheers.
you. Jenny.
Yep.
And have a great-
It's been fun. So fun.
Ciao.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks,
everybody.
Eli.
Thank you.